Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our third series of Amplify Voices of the Global Majority, focusing on the roots of yoga. My name is Kaveri Dada-Barros, and I will be your host along with my colleague, Miles Newton, for our journey together throughout this week. And tonight, as the fifth presenter of our 9-session series, we welcome Thenmozhi Soundararajan, sharing a talk called Trauma of Caste, Healing from Dharmic Traditions of Casteism. Once again, Kripalu has joined forces with change makers around the globe who work to dismantle inequity, mitigate harm, steward the planet, prioritize collective wellness, and stress interdependent liberation. Throughout history, voices of global majority, Black, Indigenous, people of color have been at the forefront of breaking down barriers of systemic issues that affect both the planet and humanity while ushering in radical change. Whether that has been through bringing yoga to the West or fighting injustice in the front lines of society. We're excited to be here with you to explore the heart and soul of the ancient practice of yoga with an incredible and thoughtful panel of South Asian yoga teachers, practitioners, wisdom keepers, and lineage holders. Now is the time that requires us to listen, heal historical wounds, and to do something different. We enter this work as an act of community care because none of us are well unless we are all well. So again, welcome. We're inspired to be sharing this space with you all. We are honored to gather today virtually located in the Berkshire Hills of Massachusetts on the original homelands of Stockbridge Munsee Band of Mohicans. And on behalf of the Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health, we invite you to use the link in the chat to learn about what land you are on and its indigenous inhabitants. Please take a moment to share with us the lands you are calling from by typing it into the chat. Today, Kripalu works in reverence with these lands as a nonprofit educational organization dedicated to empowering people and communities to realize their full potential through the transformative wisdom and practice of yoga. Our Amplified Voices series has been made possible because of the generous gifts of our donors. We thank them, and we thank you all for your presence with us this evening. As a part of this collective space we share tonight, we would like to center our online community agreements. So we are posting them in the chat for everyone. Please take a moment to read them over and know that by being here in this space, you are acknowledging and opting into them. And we thank you for that. Let us take a moment to settle in a bit more together, and let's take 3 conscious breaths collectively. Inhaling through the nose and gently exhaling through the mouth. You can close your eyes or lower your gaze. Let's begin. Thank you all. With deep appreciation and reverence, we welcome Thenmozhi Soundararajan as your guide for the evening. Thenmozhi is a Dalit American artist, community organizer, technologist, theorist, and author of The Trauma of Caste, a Dalit feminist meditation on survivorship, healing, and abolition. Thenmozhi is a co-founder and executive director of Equality Labs, the largest Dalit civil rights organization working to empower caste-oppressed people in the United States and globally. Through her work at Equality Labs, she has mobilized South Asian Americans towards dismantling systems of oppression with the goal of ending caste apartheid, gender-based violence, white supremacy, and religious intolerance. You can learn more about Thenmozhi and the toolkit we'll be sending at the end of the summit. During Thenmozhi's presentation, Miles and I are here to support your needs. Our info is in the chat. Please feel free to direct message us if you need anything. Towards the end of the session, there may be an opportunity to have questions answered that have gathered using the Q&A feature located in your Zoom toolbar at the bottom or at the top of your screen if you're on your phone. Please make sure to use this feature rather than typing questions into the chat. Now, without further ado, we welcome in Thenmozhi. Welcome, Thenmozhi. Thank you for being here. Namaste.
Thank you, J. Beam, and such a wonderful and beautiful thing to be here. And thank you for that wonderful introduction, Kaveri. So again, my name is Thenmozhi Soundararajan, and I am a caste-oppressed yoga practitioner, and I'm also the author of The Trauma of Caste. And a lot of my discussion today is we talk about some of the pain that is at the heart of some Dharmic lineages is really ways that we might be able to work together to both acknowledge historical harms, but also build a pathway to more inclusive yoga spaces overall. So it is really an honor to be able to have an open dialogue with everyone here, and looking forward to get started. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. And, to give you a little bit of a background on The Trauma of Caste, this is a book that encompasses over 20 years of thinking and practice that I've done about caste equity work all around the United States. And there is a lot within it for every single person who is a Dharmic seeker. And it was very difficult to actually put together for myself because so much of caste is shrouded in mystery. It's also shrouded in a lot of gaslighting, and many caste oppressed people often still are in the closet. So to be able to have a space that is centered in healing, but also courageous conversation is really, really an important thing. And this is actually one of the first times we're having such a deeply public conversation about yoga and caste within yoga communities at Kripalu. So we are all part of making a very powerful history and commitment to healing by even having this discussion. And sometimes I think when we talk about pain and intergenerational trauma that comes from historical systems of violence, there is discomfort. And I really just want to flag that discomfort is a really crucial part of us opening to new ways of thinking, to new ways of being, and new ways that we want to interact in the world. And I always think about the fact that when you're in a yoga class, like probably the most common way we talk about discomfort is about hip openers. And so we might be doing like the pigeon pose, and we're just like, just working on all the emotions that are stuck in that joint. And we're, at most yogis I know, when you get to that hip opener sequence, people give it their all because they're ready to embrace the discomfort of what's required to let go of somatized emotions that might be laying in our hips. And I think I want to just encourage people to bring that same kind of mindset to the opening that's required to heal from structural violence. And if we allow ourselves to sit with discomfort as opposed to moving away, we can see expansion about how our heart approaches very painful historical wounds and our minds, so that we can then lay the path and be the leaders that can create yoga sanghas that are open for all. And part of why this is so important to me is that I actually, I've been a yoga practitioner for over 20 years, but there was a gap of 10 years where I stopped practicing, in part because of some of the exclusive behaviors I saw in yoga sanghas. And, at the time I was part of a very popular yoga sangha in Berkeley. And I think that the way that this American yoga teacher dogmatically presented yoga lineages and its teachings, it was so exclusive and so inappropriate in terms of the ways that it tried to distill a very complex history and region with thousands of years of historical conflicts and trauma into very bite-sized nodules that presented himself as the expert, and therefore any other contrary opinion to those contexts was seen as inappropriate. And I think the turning point for me was when I was asking him questions as a caste oppressed practitioner about how you reconcile some of the things he was saying about yoga and its foundations with Brahminical teachers, with the lack of access that caste oppressed people did not have, in traditional times to such practices. And what he said was, well, there's probably a deep reason for that. Even the caste system has its own place because, as my teacher told me, not everyone is fit to be a teacher. Not everyone is fit to be a ruler. And certainly some people will need to serve. And when I have a white male yoga teacher telling me as a caste oppressed person that there are some people who are not fit to teach, to learn, be learned, to have access to the sacred, but that there are those who deserve to be servile, that just was the end. And there were many, many different experiences that I had that were akin to that. But I walked away from that yoga class thinking this space is not for me. And that's a tremendous tragedy that, looking back on who I was in my 20s, that I want to prevent for other people who experience that. And we know that we're in this great renaissance in terms of yogic conversations where American yoga is wrestling with multiple ways of, making sure that we're having diversity of teachers, diversities of bodies. And I think that while we have now embraced land acknowledgements and racial equity acknowledgements, we actually haven't talked about the core historical wound that is at the heart of Dharmic lineages, which is that of caste. And I think that when we start to have that open discourse, we actually see that there's much about how we are trained in yoga, where we are trained by misinformation, not actually historical evidence and fact, and that we have a bunch of tools at our disposal to continue to adapt and evolve our sanghas to how we want to be inclusive for all. So I always think back in time to that, 20-year-old, 20-something old self of mine, and really think about the fact that I want to give her healing, and that by having this discussion, we are able to ensure that no other person leaves a sangha because they feel like they do not have a place there. And another piece of this, which I also think is really important, is that I'm sure all of us have had those moments of dissonance when you're in a particular yoga tradition. And some yoga sanghas are more dogmatic than others. But oftentimes I hear with a lot of practitioners where people feel dissonance with what's being told to them about the history of their lineage or a teacher's particular practice or the ways that they might enforce or gatekeep around particular practices. And the one thing, if I can leave any of you here with a piece of this knowledge, is that surrender on the mat is not the surrender of your politics, your critical thinking, your experiences of historical violence, and most crucially, your consent. And this is so crucial because I think that bodily autonomy is one of the first things to go under the caste system. And so when we are committed to caste equity, one of the things that we do when we create our practices for somatic healing, we must not lose any of these pieces. And if you are in a yoga sangha where you are feeling your politics, your ability to critically think and to challenge, and your sense of your lineage and your history, if they're ever at any point removed from you, then this is not a proper process for you to be a part of. And too many Americans who enter these yoga spaces, and because they're taught in very dogmatic ways, they think that in order to achieve nirvana or integration, that they have to give up any of these pieces. And that's actually related to the way that spiritual processes are gatekept under the caste system. So that's why I really want to emphasize this piece, that our process for caste equity isn't just for making sure our sanghas include caste oppressed people, but they're actually also about changing the way that teachings occur within Dharmic practice. both in terms of the dialectic between teacher and student, but also who gets to have access to the divine. Who is the person that channels the divine, and how do you make your path towards integration? All of these things I want to help you open a pathway for your own inquiry, because caste oppressed people, for our own freedom, for our own self-determination, have had to walk this lonely path around these issues. But in doing so, we offer a very unique vision of liberation for all people who continue to practice out of Dharmic spaces. Now, one thing before I continue, I wanted to just point people to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now, I will not be pausing because we are in a webinar format for questions, but if you have a question, just drop it into the Q&A bar, and Kaveri and Miles will be, notating those questions, and we'll be able to address them at the end. But I think it's so important to document all of the inquiry, because again, this is a dialogue and I'm sharing my particular experience, and I really want to hear from you all, and we will have space at the end. So now I want to go back in and talk about caste. Now, you may have heard many different understandings of what caste is. I want to include us into a joint definition for ourselves. Now, caste, as I know it, and I'm talking specifically here about the South Asian caste system, is a system of exclusion that affects more than 1.9 billion people worldwide, including in the United States. And this exclusionary system ranks people at birth, with one's caste determining every aspect of their life, from their job, where they can live, whom they marry, and where they worship. And the South Asian caste system is actually one of many different caste systems, which are known as discriminations based on descent and work. And these hierarchical systems can be found in many regions around the world, including South America, Japan, Korea, and parts of Africa. So when we are talking about a global movement for caste equity, it includes South Asian caste people, but it also includes caste oppressed people from around the world. And so this is very important, especially when we start to talk about the civil rights movement related to caste, because this is a category that is global in nature and affects multiple people impacted from lineages of violence everywhere. And just to give you like a little short visual of the different caste systems, I'm not going to go into them, but I just wanted to show you caste is found in every region of the world, many different kinds of lineages, and many different faith practices. So over here, you have the Nepali caste system, which is based in Hindu scripture. You have on the right these two pyramids here, which are caste systems that come from Latin America, from the Spanish history of conquest, the first being the caste system that happened in North America, the bottom being the racial hierarchy system in the Philippines. And then over here, you have the Japanese caste system, which also had a caste oppressed people. And here is the caste system found in Muslim communities as well. So it is very diverse, and within a particular yoga practice, you may have caste oppressed people from all of these different backgrounds, which is, again, one of the reasons why we're asking yoga communities to really consider the ways that they center caste equity in their practices. And to me, I think that, as someone who is caste oppressed, and I'm currently a Buddhist, but I was born a Hindu, and I've had parents from both a Hindu and a Christian background. I have seen caste be at the heart of many different communities of religious practices. And if you're from a Dharmic lineage, this is any lineage that includes Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism. There are histories of caste oppressed violence. That is the core of some of the deepest historical transgressions that have occurred in the subcontinent. And yoga in particular owes a specific debt to caste oppressed people, because actually caste oppressed people were some of the first people to do somatic practices of integration of the mind and the body and the spirit. It's just that caste oppressed people didn't turn it into texts. It was upper caste people who actually did that because they had the privilege to write in particular languages. So if you guys, that African proverb that the history will be marked by the hunters instead of the lions, this is also true of yoga. And so I think as practitioners who are working to create inclusion in our sanghas, we must ensure that dogmatism and misinformation does not cause further harm to caste oppressed people and our yogic communities as a whole. Now, it's really important, and then this is another piece I've seen a lot with yoga, is that there is assumption that yoga is only Indian, and that the only place of note for people in terms of South Asia is India. But I wanted to just flag here that, South Asian Americans and the countries of South Asia are actually quite diverse. They include multiple nations, right? Like Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar. But it also includes people who are indentured from those communities, including Indo-Caribbean and Indo-Fijian communities, as well as Indo-African communities. And there are many different somatic practices, some of which have been integrated into more formal yoga texts, and things that are actually more seen like on the fringes, still part of the canon of somatic practices for our communities. So it's very important that even in talking about yoga, that we don't link it only to India, that we don't link it only to Hinduism, but that we see it as part of the larger spiritual history that comes out of the South Asian region. And, again, when we're saying that there's 1.9 billion South Asians in the world, that's 1 in 4 people in the world live under a caste oppressed society. And there are 5.7 million South Asian Americans. So you can imagine that here in the United States, when we're practicing yoga, we have people that are impacted by caste that are coming to every yoga class and every yoga center. So to not talk about caste is really to neglect a very key pillar of exclusion that we can work collectively to remedy. Now, I think one thing I've noticed is that there are actually a lot of different places where we can do great work around addressing pain points in yoga around caste equity. And I think a very important piece is the origin story, So a lot of times, and you guys can tap into the chat to see if you've heard this, but, oftentimes when you go to a yoga class or you're part of a yoga sangha, it's very important. You'll walk in, they'll usually have a photo of the teacher that taught the lineage there. And if you're part of like a YTT program or a yoga teacher training program, they'll often start with like a reading of the Upanishads and how, yoga has its origins as part of Indian Hindu history. In fact, the origin story is far more complex. There are hundreds of texts that actually make up the yogic canon, and they actually come from many different religious lineages. In fact, one of the first written texts related to yoga actually came from Buddhist practitioners. And in fact, the first illustrated text actually came from a Muslim Sufi yogi. So it is really, really important not to fall into that trap, to link yoga to one religion, to one nation, because yoga, even the word yoga, meant many things to many people before it was codified in a very limited understanding of yoga that we practice today, which comes from the origins of hatha yoga that we see that got consolidated in the 1900s. So, I would really encourage people, if you hear this kind of rhetoric in yoga teacher training programs or in sanghas, to challenge it and say, hey, you know what? Here's a book. And, Miles is going to drop a link in. There's a book called The Roots of Yoga. The scholar behind that book, James Mallison, he actually provides, direct translations of many of these different yoga texts. And just by reading them, you get exposed to how diverse yogic practice and traditions were. And a key thing to kind of understand about why I'm talking about this is that, caste, the way that it operated, particularly in ancient times, was really mapped first to the Hindu understanding of caste. And so within that context, Brahmins, who were the writers of the laws, they created a sense of spiritual hierarchy where everyone below them, in terms of profession, had a lowered version of spiritual purity as you went down the caste pyramid. So Brahmins were at the top, you had Kshatriyas or warriors who were at the bottom, Vaishyas were the merchants, and Shudras were the peasants. And then outside of that whole system were people who were seen to be so spiritually defiling. They were seen to be defiling even before God. They were called untouchable because to touch them was to also be defiled. And, and obviously nobody gets to determine anyone's, perspective before the divine. And so these communities reject the term untouchable. And in fact, we call ourselves Dalits or any other name but that. But, the result of us being so excluded was that we were forced to do slave and bonded labor, undignified sanitation work, like picking up the shit of other communities, and being exposed to extreme structural violence to prevent us from our assertions. There was also indigenous communities called Adivasis that were part of it. And the key part of this system was that the higher up you were in the pyramid, the more spiritual purity you had, and therefore the greater access to opportunities of advancement, which included ownership of resources, arable land, clean water, education, and employment. You were also the most pure in that result. And there was another piece of this system, which I think is also really important as we think about language and processes that we use in yoga classes, is that the idea of these castes was that you were born into your caste because of your deeds from your past life. In fact, it was your dharmic duty to fulfill your caste obligation, because to do so would be to break the cosmic order. So Brahmins were born as Brahmins because they did great deeds in past lives, and those that were born untouchable or Dalit had done criminal things in a past life. And, I can tell you as someone who grew up in an untouchable Dalit body, this is an extremely traumatic process. In fact, it's a very carceral spiritual system, because the way that reincarnation, with the ways of karma and dharma are spoken about, is that it sets up a process where you can't challenge the conditions of your oppression, because to do so would be to break your dharmic duty. So it's very much a trap. And it's one of the reasons, again, like I would really encourage people not to use terms like karma in yoga spaces, because it's, certainly we can think about consequences of actions in this lifetime, but when we're talking about it in dharmic traditions where you are trapped because of your deeds of a past life, it's horrific. And I know as a child, when I found out I was untouchable, I always wondered, like, what did I do in a past life? Was I a rapist? Was I a criminal? Was I a thief? And that level of shame and punishment, it's something that lingers in your body. And it's a lot of the embodiment work that caste oppressed people must do, because there is no spiritual mandate for our exclusion. That this is all a social fiction created by people that wanted to dominate, and I think this is so important to know, that this is a social fiction, because in many yoga lineages, the teacher of the lineage is Brahmin. And they emphasize that Brahmins are the learned people that carried these traditions. So if we continue that social fiction by lifting up this one caste over others, we are inadvertently also supporting the hegemony of knowledge that existed because of these caste systems. And, just to understand caste and the body, part of the breakdown of this caste pyramid, it actually came from the Rig Veda, and there's the Purushukta hymn, where they talk about, Purusha was actually the cosmic being, and the division and the creation of man happened that certain, classes of men came from different parts of his body. So in this blue being, you'll see different people at different parts of his body. Those are the different castes. So you have the Brahmins that came from the mouth, the ruling caste, the Kshatriyas, the Rajaya came from the arms, the being called Vaishyas, which are the merchant, came from his thighs, the Shudras, or those at the peasants class, came from his feet. So there is an actual linkage of the cosmic body that actually gets replicated in many yogic teachings down the line, which is why I wanted to show you this. Because in some ways, like when we think of Judeo-Christian lineages, we often think of the saint and the sinner binary. And that is something that kind of colors all of Western society. Well, in Dharmic traditions, our binary is purity and pollution. So our aim is always to purify the body, purify the mind, purify the spirit, because we want to be the most pure in the cosmic sense. And the pollution is what we're always trying to remove. But there are certain parts of the body, certain peoples that are kind of linked to that. And this binary can often, glom onto historical injustices. And that's what we have to be really careful of addressing, particularly as we're helping people come into balance. We don't want to use language that reinscribes parts of these casteist thinkings. So another kind of key kind of language piece that I would really also encourage people to think about is that, would we talk about racism without discussing white supremacy? And in asking that question, we're talking about racism as kind of the symptom, right? The consequences of the ideology of white supremacy is, structural racism, where people of certain races are excluded out of structural and interpersonal processes. So too, caste is a consequence of the animating ideology that created the divisions of humans under the system. And the analogy to white supremacy in our context is Brahmanism. So a lot of times when you start to enter caste equity discourses, you might see Brahminical as like an adjective. So Brahminical patriarchy, or that's a Brahminical process. So when we're using that term, we're not like centering or talking about individual Brahmins or members of the individual Brahmin caste. We're talking about the supremacist ideology. And this is a well-known word that's used in many academic discourses, many historical discourses related to this issue. And so just want to help you guys feel comfortable using and understanding those terms. Now, the consequences of caste are very real. And this is some data on caste-based discrimination just on South Asia. And if you just kind of do a summary of what we're seeing here, caste oppressed people, like an every development indicator, suffer tremendously from exclusion and underdevelopment. We have the highest, illiteracy rates. We have deep and disturbing poverty. We also are landless, and there's extreme violence, so that in India, for example, every day 3 Dalits are murdered, 2 are raped, and several houses are burnt, with the crime against a caste-oppressed person happening every 18 minutes. So this is a tremendous data point. And in fact, one data point that also really kind of struck me, especially as I've been working on embodiment practices, was that the average age of mortality for Dalit women was 40 years old. So imagine that, what that means for a community, that the average age of the women in that community are dying at 40. I mean, that's tremendous, So it is very important that we work on this issue. And in the United States, my organization, Equality Labs, conducted one of the first surveys related to caste discrimination. And we found that here in the United States, 1 in 4 caste oppressed people responded that they have faced physical and verbal assault on the basis of their caste. 1 in 3 reported being discriminated against in their education, and 2 out of 3 reported being treated unfairly in their workplace. And so as a result, 1 in 2 of all Dalit respondents live in fear of being outed and therefore lived in the closet. So this is a very serious issue. And certainly for me, when I first started yoga classes, I was definitely not out. Like after my first experience with that one yoga teacher, I almost never came out to yoga classes because I didn't think it was safe. And so while other people were very much, using that space to be grounded in their practice, grounded in their community, grounded in who they were, I was hiding and isolating myself because I didn't feel safe. And that's, again, one of the reasons why I'm speaking out about this issue is I want to make yoga sanghas, home for many different communities and lineages, including caste oppressed people, because it's an awful experience to live in the closet. And one other last kind of definition point that I wanted to give to you guys about thinking about caste is that, caste is very much a soul wound. And a soul wound is a framework for understanding systems of violence that some of you may or may not be introduced to. It came out of the work of Indigenous thinker Eduardo Duran and, the Black somatic abolitionist Resma Menachem, amongst many others, who talk about soul wounds as wounds that are that represent the heartrending intergenerational pain that all of us carry from historical trauma that results from the systems that you may be part of. So for me, I am, one of my big soul wounds is that of caste apartheid. There may be people here who have soul wounds from, indigenous conquest and the genocide that began the United States, or those who come from backgrounds that were part of enslaved Africans that, began as part of the slave trade. All of us have a soul wound. And I think some of the work that we're doing when we are in somatic spaces with each other is our embodiment. The inability for us to sometimes settle is not just from the struggles of our current present life. It's about what lays unsettled in the soul wounds that we carry from our own historical pain. And working on that is a very profound thing. And it's actually one of the great promises of somatic practices is for us to look at embodiment as a pathway to healing structural exclusion. Because in some ways, what soul wounds do, and whether it's the caste soul wound, the racial soul wound, you name it, is that they bind the privileged and the oppressed into a painful cycle of violence. Because, on one hand, in the bodies of the oppressed, there's fear, there's anxiety, there's depression, but in the bodies of the privileged, there is fragility, there is anxiety, there is a need to, leave behind the discomfort. And as a result, those in privileged bodies generate policies that are artifacts of their soul wounds. So in some ways, just as we try to bring mindfulness to our individual body in yoga practice, we can bring mindfulness to our community sanghas about the ways that we are held hostage by hierarchical systems that hold our bodies and minds and spirit entrapped in this way. And this work isn't like a one-off workshop. It's not a one-time session. It's collective work that requires deep care and kindness and an iterative work that allows us to kind of talk, take a break, see where it sits in our body, come back, and then begin again until we slowly start to ease and melt away some of our training that comes from this soul wound. So it is a long process. And I've done a lot of work around the caste soul wound. And I find that in yoga, we have many tools. Some of them have been weaponized against caste as a soul wound, and some that we might repurpose to great opening for ourselves. And this is a very deep, powerful moment because South Asians all around the world are having a reckoning with our internal hegemonies. Just the fact that we're having this conversation is a result of the caste equity movement around the world, moving to bring caste oppressed voices into global discourse and for us to actually ask for healing to the historical trauma that's related to caste and other difficult histories. And as a Dharmic lineage, yoga cannot ignore that. Yoga must actually respond to this moment, just like yoga responded to the murder of George Floyd and the ask of Black Lives Matters and the crisis in Gaza. So this is another really powerful moment that I think we can do beautiful interventions together. And as South Asians heal, yoga too will continue to evolve and become more expansive as it acknowledges pains of the past. And, I know that there's some people who have been, resistant to some of these changes. And, the thing that I say to that is that, we don't practice yoga the way that it was practiced centuries ago. I mean, how many people are putting a rod in their anus to do cleansing of the intestines? They're not. How many people are eating that miles-long cloth to clean the upper intestinal tract? We don't do that, right? There's lots of things that we don't do. I mean, if we were practicing yoga the way we did in the days, we wouldn't even have yoga mats, right? We have adapted yoga to our context And if we can adapt for comfort, we can adapt to make sure that every single person that wants to be part of our sanghas can be and should be there, you know. So areas to explore for inclusion in yoga, and I just want to kind of lift this up again for everybody, is a discussion of history and lineages, enforcing rules on Sanskrit, heteronormative maps of the body, and overly obsessing on purity and pollution divides. So, you know, as I mentioned earlier, yoga history is so diverse. And, you know, being able to even, like, if you're in a yoga teacher training program, I would suggest like having a slide that shows, you know, the first yoga text, which was, you know, one of the first was a Buddhist text that was actually in Pali, you know, because I see sometimes like in yoga classes, they talk about the supremacy of Sanskrit, and that Sanskrit was the only language used to teach and be part of yoga practices, which is not true. Many that have defined and been part of the yoga lineages are in multiple languages, from Tibetan, Arabic, Persian, Bengali, Tamil, Pali, Kashmiri, all Marathi, and even precursors of Hindi. And so the fact that it's so diverse, I just really want to just emphasize for everyone here again, we can share that yoga is a rich history that has many origins, and that to preserve that diversity actually strengthens our yoga practice, not limits it, you know, because what is being presented right now is a very ideologically driven version of yoga, which is not helpful to erase so many centuries of other traditions that were shared. And the significance that one of the first yoga texts was Buddhist is that, you know, in the development of the caste system, especially as it started under Hinduism, you know, certainly while castes are found now in every community of religious practice, the caste movements to, you know, to end caste in the early centuries of the South Asian history were very much rooted in like religious debate and philosophical and engagement. So Brahmanism was the animating, you know, framework that informed the development of Vedic Hindu practice. The challenging system to that was something called Shamanism. Shra, S-H-R-A, Shamanism. You also see other kind of versions of that written. And that was the animating ideology between these like resistant religious traditions like Buddhism and Jainism. And at the heart of that opposition between Brahmanism and Shamanism was who got to be the interlocutor of the divine. So under Brahmanism, it's the priests, it's the Brahmin priests. That was the whole point of the creation of that ideological framework. But under Shamanism, the idea was that the divine was intimate, it was personal, and every person had the right to access the divine. That was the heart of early Buddhist practice. And that's why yoga was part of some of those Buddhist schools, because that's how people were thinking about integrative practice. And I think that origin story is a really beautiful example to kind of share how yoga was never just about a dominating hierarchical single person defining who can have access to the power. There was always battles and dialogues and debates and you know, practices that were challenging to each other from these different schools about this very issue. So I want to encourage that, because this is actually what helps us give a philosophical foundation for the equity work that we're doing, is that those debates were there from the beginning. It was never centralized. There was always challenges, discourse, and different, you know, diversities of training and processes and practices. And I think that it's very important that a certain version of the history that we're learning is very much weaponized, so that you know, when this history is erased, it allows for the domination of other people in present time. So it's very important not to flatten this history. And in fact, you know, one of the challenges right now with yoga practice is that it is heavily weaponized by people who are from, you know, nationalist backgrounds in South Asia. And this is Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who's a known Hindu nationalist. And he's also a known yoga advocate and has pushed International Yoga Day. And it's been quite concerning, because while they're pushing for these big Yoga Day ceremonial practices, they're also diminishing the rights and targeting religious minorities quite extensively. And there's a really great article that Miles will be sharing from, a teacher from Philadelphia who wrote an article for Al Jazeera about this. And there's also been many teachers who have spoken about this, like Susanna Barataki. Prachapatankar also wrote a really beautiful article about this. Anjali Rao also talks a lot about this. And that's why stepping into this conversation and reducing yoga only to Hindu origins, you're inadvertently also supporting, yoga washing or om washing of a very challenging time of religious conflict in our region. Now, another thing that I think that happens in yoga practices, which is really exclusive, is this hyper focus on teaching things in Sanskrit. And I remember being in a yoga class and having a teacher tell me Sanskrit is the only holy language. And when any syllable that you say in yoga and Sanskrit will ultimately lead to your transcendence. And that's why we don't want to use other languages. It's only Sanskrit because Sanskrit itself is holy. And I remember thinking this was a bunch of horseshit because I was like, come on now. Like, how can one language above any be the only portal to sacredness? But the other reason why I thought that was an absurd statement to say is that as someone who is caste oppressed, many of the Hindu scriptures that, were developed in terms of setting up the frameworks of Brahmanism, they explicitly say that people from a caste oppressed background, if they spoke Sanskrit, they would get their tongues cut off and they would get lead poured in their ears. And so I would always think about that when I would go into a yoga class where people would be forced to do mantras, or there was this like deification of Sanskrit, because I just could not settle my body and my nervous system to think that the only pathway to integration was a language that my ancestors were forbidden to speak and to hear and to write in, and that language was actually the language that created the frameworks of our enslavement. That's outrageous. So I really want to challenge it. It's why I talked about in the origins of yoga that yoga texts came in many different languages. It is perfectly fine to read things in Sanskrit and certainly share things in Sanskrit, but I really want to encourage people not to deify Sanskrit, and also not to, to consider many different kinds of opening of mantras, not just Sanskrit mantras, because there will be caste oppressed people who will not participate in mantras because they feel unsafe. And it also is a reminder of the violence, the way that this language was used. And this person that I'm showing to you right now, this is, one of the authors of this text, this horrific text called the Manusmriti, which had very, very defining laws that were horrific. It defined the terms of our slavery, the kinds of ways we'd be enslaved, and it was extremely patriarchal, and the ways that women could be sexually abused and misused were all sanctioned by religious practices, So it is not, it is a very serious thing to enforce Sanskrit and not be inclusive of communities that were harmed by actually Sanskrit only spaces and practices. And, a good way to think about this is that exclusive language sets up exclusive practices. And again, this is very, very serious in the context of Dharmic lineages, because we have a long history in our religious texts of excluding caste oppressed people from spiritual practices. So this image I have here is of a Shudra named Shambhuka, who was written about in one of the versions of the Ramayana, which is a very famous text in Hindu scripture, which tells the adventures of, Rama, who was an avatar of God. And essentially what happened is that, several Brahmins came to Rama in his court to say that something was going wrong. There was like a disturbance in the force, if you want to call it that. And so Rama went off in his flying chariot to see what was going on. And what he did is he found that there was a Shudra who very desperately wanted to be an ascetic and ascend to heaven. So he was doing his, ablutions, essentially like different ascetic yoga practices. And he said, all I want to do is to ascend to heaven. And he doesn't even get to finish his statement before Rama, cuts off his head. And the crime of this person was only that he was a Shudra who aspired to spiritual practice and renunciation. That was his only crime. And as soon as he does it, flowers rain on, Rama from all of the different gods. And this has been a pattern of practice to punish caste oppressed people that have the gall to aspire to divinity and ascetic practices, which is extremely ironic because if you read the histories of yoga, somatic practices were part of indigenous communities for many, many years, even before written text. We've always done integrative practices. All humans do. The right to be integrated is a divine right for all of us. And to see this so shamefully presented as a core text, it's just maddening. So again, this is the loaded context of yoga practice that I really just want to emphasize for people. We have to, if we are practicing a Dharmic lineage, we must stop any attempts to exclude people, especially if it's through language or the teaching of history or any of these other kind of aspects. Now, another part where I've seen in casted thinking and processes in yoga is heteronormative maps of the body. And for people that are kind of like, deep readers of yogic practice, you might recognize this image. But, one of the philosophical frameworks within yoga is that, we are doing yogic practice to essentially, have more disciplined, routing of our Shakti, our energy in our body. And that, with more and more esoteric practices of yoga, we're actually able to control and be able to navigate work within our different nadis or channels that, can either be, activating energy, as in the Pingala Nadi, or we can, pick up things that are part of our more passive channels, which is like the Ida Nadi. You could kind of think of it as like parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems from a scientific perspective. Now, one of the challenges because, so much of caste also is linked to gender as well, is that oftentimes Pingala and Ida are linked to male and female maps of the body. And, there's a lot of people that have obviously done a lot of work to think about getting past some of the gender structures within yoga. But I think this is something that we should really think about, that, the esoteric mapping of the body that we get from many lineages are helpful maps, but they are not declarative statements of our body and our minds and our spirits. In fact, part of the reasons why I've said that many different spiritual traditions all across the world have somatic practices, I say that because one, I want people not to only lift up yoga as the only path towards somatic integration, but also to recognize that every single one of the religious traditions that have a somatic practice is limited by the egos who translated that teaching. So, Pingala and Ida divisions don't have to be male and female. They can literally just be passive and active energies. They can be states of matter and energy versus definitive to what is a male framework and what is a female framework. And this is so critical because in working with, queer and trans practitioners, I think that already, we know with some yoga positions, like if you have breasts, they are very difficult in the way that they are taught. Like, if you're doing peacock pose or cobra pose, like some of the ways that, they are often suggested, since many of the texts only feature cis male bodies, it's just not been adaptable. And we have, as practitioners, started to adapt that. I also want to encourage people to adapt the language and make sure that we're not repeating these kind of gendered mappings of the body. And this continues also, I think, with even understanding, how do we understand the discipline of yoga? So I know, again, and I don't know, I guess I go back to this one like terrible yoga class that I kept having, but I remember being in this one yoga class with a teacher, and he was, a lot of yoga classes, especially American teachers, they set up their sessions very similar to how they received, their training back in India. So this guy would kind of hold court where he would like sit on a little dais and all of the people would kind of fall around him, and he tells little stories about India. And his one story was like, we have to talk about the discipline of yoga. We have to talk about how the discipline of yoga is like Shiva, and we're using that to tame Shakti, which is our energy, our senses. And so he's like, whenever I think about it, I think about this time I went to Varanasi, and I was watching this one sadhu, and he had a cat of nine tails, and he would flagellate himself, and he'd say, "You whore Shakti, you whore Shakti." And he's like, well, certainly that's not my path. But we want to think about the fact that sometimes the only way to discipline Shakti, our senses, is through the might of Shiva, our yoga practice. When he said that, I looked around to see, did anybody else have a reaction here? Because again, there is no reason to bring gendered language in this. We don't have to talk about the senses and our desire to connect to the world as a whorish impulse and the whorish Shakti that could only be tamed by physical violence. But that kind of, again, that is a filter of a failed ego, in multiple forms. And so again, I want to encourage us to, certainly we may have heard those language and frameworks from the teachers and lineages we're a part of, but we can become much bigger than those words. We have a very, very powerful relationship with the known and the unknown world that is our divine birthright. And we should not use limiting language that all of a sudden makes us smaller and also reinforces frameworks of violence that are just wildly inappropriate, And so again, go beyond the gender frameworks and think about ways that we can be inclusive in that language. And that in some ways, I think that the way I think about yoga is through integration and somatic opening, and being able to think about that which is hard within us and that which we need to soften, and to be able to think about touch and movement with tenderness. Because in some ways, the language of yoga practice that hasn't really begun the work to, unlearn its caste embodiment is also a practice in which dominator systems are embodied. And so we must be able to be slow but intentional about, checking what we're being learned in these practices with what our body is telling us and what is potentially open to us in that way. And that in some ways, I think, for people, I know there's some people here that are Ayurvedic practitioners. There's some people who might be yoga teachers. I want to also encourage people to be cautious and to be very thoughtful about the ways that you talk about purity and pollution, So for example, when you do pranayama, it's always about, we're trying to purify the blood, and in Ayurveda, you're thinking about using different herbs and combinations of treatments to achieve purity, right? And there's nothing wrong with detoxification. There's nothing wrong with having a diet that's holistic and practices that help integration. But the obsession of purity and the punishment that is linked with pollution is something I want you guys to observe in the dogmatism of your training and how you might be also replicating. Because, for example, in some, yogic practices, people assume, the same word that they use for untouchability. So say I speak Tamil, for example. In Tamil, we use the word tita to talk about pollution that's related to untouchability. It's also the same term that's used for women when they're on their period. It refers to the pollution that those women have, because being on your period is seen as a time of pollution. Now, that's a very, very specific judgmental frame to talk about what's required for women when they're menstruating, or bodies that are menstruating, right? And I was really shocked by that, because even in my language, in Tamil, the term for menstruation is Vitika Duram, which means the distance from the house. Because technically, women who are menstruating were supposed to not live with other people. They're supposed to be in a separate place. And this wasn't because people were caring and wanted to give you a space to have a timeout. It was really because you were seen as polluting to other people. So that same thinking process that said that women who were menstruating were dirty and polluting and could not touch or prepare food or be around other people is the same kind of pollution model that we use in Ayurvedic healing systems and yogic systems. And so I think we have to just, use our mindset. Like, certainly for me, like when I think about yoga, it makes sense that under yoga, you would not necessarily have women, bodies that are menstruating doing like headstands or inversion positions. But any other commentary related to pollution or condemnation of bodies that are menstruating, I think is about the purity and pollution divide that you want to explore. So everyone here has their own practices that they might be considering and start to apply a critical eye. And I just want to encourage that process even further. And some of the things that I think that we achieve when we do this is that there is a potential with integrated yoga practices of limitless embodiment. And that's really what I want to open for you all. Because when we're not policing the body and creating carceral practices and defining what can be eaten, who's allowed to be your partner, who is pure and who is not pure, there's an opening to pleasure. There's an opening to sensuous practices, and there's an opening to love. And that's fundamentally all of the places that I think we would like to be able to build. So in some ways, and I want to point people to this practice in my book, is that, as you're trying to build caste equity, there can be some friction, and I think that there's a really useful process called RAIN that Ruth King integrates in her book, Mindfulness of Race, that I've adapted to caste. And it really is about introducing a little bit of pause when you have a trigger. Sometimes you might be really annoyed by what you're hearing when people are talking about caste equity. Or maybe you're a caste or racially oppressed person that's feeling a trigger because someone has really wronged you or said something really outrageous. Before going from trigger to action, the process of RAIN basically introduces mindfulness so that you can pause a little bit, create a little bit of distance by both allowing the trauma response to unfold in your body, but then to say, I'm anger, but I'm not my anger. Because oftentimes from the trigger to action, the reason why we act so quickly is because we assume that we are at the motion of that action. So by applying some of our yogic principles of breath, of mindfulness, of grounding, we can then create a little bit of distance, bring our prefrontal cortex in by investigating and understanding what's happening. And then all action doesn't have to be fight. It can actually be about nurturing. Oh, sorry. I see Kripalu raise your hand. Go ahead. Did someone raise their hand?
Thenmozhi, yeah, we were just noting that we're getting towards time.
Oh, great. I will wrap up. No problem. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop my share here. So I think that, to end, I think one of the things that is really important for people is that there's a lot of different ways for us to create opening for each other related to caste equity. And if I could leave you with some couple of things, one thing I would ask everyone here who is committed to caste equity is to consider adding caste as a protected category in your sanghas. It's a very small but really powerful way that I think that everyone here can help make their sanghas inclusive. I also think you might consider adding a line of caste equity acknowledgements to your land and racial justice acknowledgements. And I can send an example to our follow-ups here. But that acknowledgement really makes a difference for people like myself and anyone who's from a caste oppressed background to know that this is a safe space. I also think sanghas can also consider celebrating Dalit History Month, which is in April, and maybe including pictures of caste oppressed people on the altars of your lineages. Because again, what we're trying to do with caste equity is to recognize it is a diverse tradition. We continue to evolve around that diversity, and that by healing in present time, we heal ourselves and our communities collectively. So there is so much more. And, I know that Miles will be dropping a link to my book if people want to do more deep dives related to caste. And in the follow-up packet, I'll also include a little toolkit of links and ways to be able to open that up together.
Thank you so much, Thenmozhi. Beautiful, deep, rich presentation. I know my mind is personally blown. Lots to sit with, lots to take in and really feel into. There's so much appreciation in the chat for you. I think everyone's really appreciative of how deep you went in with this presentation. Thank you so much. There are several really thought-provoking questions in here. We'll try to capture those for you and send them your way and try to get them to you, okay? But we have come to time with this presentation. Thank you all for joining us for this presentation of the trauma of caste, healing from Dharmic traditions of casteism, Thenmozhi. Special thank you again to you, Thenmozhi, and to our donors for supporting this third year of our Amplify Voices Global Majority series. And thanks again to you all for your presence with us online. Your support is vital for our Amplified series. Together, we uplift voices of global majority dedicated to dismantling injustice and nurturing our planet. Your donations power this transformative work. There's a link in the chat if you want to learn more about supporting Kripalu's efforts.